Okay, so I want to kind of talk about this Israel Palestine thing, maybe give you a little bit of a different perspective on it. So I'm going to talk about the settlements, I'm going to talk about the occupation, I'm going to talk about the two-state solution, I'm going to talk about Islam, I'm going to talk about Jerusalem, I'm going to talk about Judaism and Christianity and the whole history of this whole thing. I'm not going to sit here and try to sell you on my beliefs. I am a believer, and I'm not going to try to sell you on that. I'm not going to try to tell you you have to believe by me in that way. But I am going to ask you to accept simple historical facts that have to do with certain topics dealing with that. And that's all I'm going to ask you to try to deal with me. And if you find that maybe you know something that I don't know, or you have a disagreement with the facts that I'm putting out there, please be my guest and present those to me in the comments. I will not delete any comments. I don't do that. See, the thing about me is I believe in freedom of speech, and I believe in, having a democratic republic. And that's what I love about Israel is a country where people can criticize their government. And you can't do that in Egypt. You can't do that in Syria. You can't do that in Iran. You can't do that in Iraq. You can't do that in Afghanistan. You can't do that anywhere else in the region. And so let's be really clear about those terms, is that I'm going to allow you to speak your mind. But there are people in this world who would not. And so I think that having Israel in the land is very important for that region, because you have Palestinians who serve in the Knesset, which is like basically the Congress of Israel. You have Muslims who serve in the military. You have Muslims who serve in high position jobs, like doctors and lawyers and all of these different things, who own property and do all of these different things in Israel. But because of certain Sharia laws, and because of what's called the jizya in Islam, there are actual apartheid going on against Jews in those countries, where they're not allowed to be the boss of their company. They're not allowed to serve in the government or in the military. They're not allowed to repair their buildings and do these things like that. So there's a lot of actual restrictions that go on in those countries. And this video isn't meant to degrade anyone. Anyone who knows me knows I have a lot of Muslim friends. I have a lot of Christian friends. I have a lot of Jewish friends. I have a lot of friends from all over in different walks of life. It has nothing to do with that. This has to do with the facts of the matter. And this has to do with addressing the claims that are kind of being thrown around. So you'll hear a lot about ethnic cleansing by Israel, that they're doing ethnic cleansing of Palestinians and trying to push them out. First of all, let's address this idea. In 1948, there were over 700,000 Muslims or Arabs in the land of Israel, or Palestine, or whatever you want to call it. Today, there's over 7 million of them. So this argument about ethnic cleansing doesn't really measure up in comparison to the numbers of Jews in the Arab countries who have been subject to pogroms and slaughter and all types of different ethnic cleansing over the years. And you can take a look at the numbers for yourself on that.
Now let's compare those numbers. Morocco in 1948 had 265,000 Jews. Today, 2,150. Libya used to have 38,000 Jews. Today, not a single Jew. Iraq, 135,000 Jews. Today, less than 10. Algeria, 140,000 Jews. Today, less than 50. Egypt used to have 75,000 Jews. Today, 100. Yemen used to have 63,000 Jews. Today, less than 50. Tunisia, 105,000.
Today, only 1,050. Syria, 30,000 Jews in 1948. Today, only 100.
Lebanon used to have 5,000 Jews. Today, less than 100.
Once upon a time, the Middle East was full of Jews. Algeria had 140,000 Jews. Algeria, where are your Jews? Egypt used to have 75,000 Jews. Where are your Jews? Syria, you had tens of thousands of Jews. Where are your Jews? Iraq, you had over 135,000 Jews. Where are your Jews? Mr. President, why are we meeting today on an agenda item singling out only one state, the Jewish state, for targeting? Where is the apartheid, Mr. President?
We continue with the United Nations Watch.
Mr. President, 1 year ago in this chamber, I asked the Arab states a simple question. Where are your Jews? My question was met with dead silence. Millions of people worldwide watched the video, witnessing for themselves the hypocrisy and double standards that characterizes much of what is said and done here. Today I have come to provide the answer to my question. Algeria, Iraq, Syria, Egypt, Lebanon, Yemen, Libya. Your Jews fled as refugees after suffering persecution and deadly pogroms like the Farhud of Baghdad in 1941. Fortunately, countries like Israel, the US, Canada, France, and others opened their doors offering citizenship and equal rights. These Jewish refugees from Arab lands whose suffering and losses the UN has never addressed put their hardship behind them and built great lives for their families. Now let us contrast this with the situation of those descended from Arab refugees who fled the area of British mandatory Palestine during the invasion of nascent Israel by Arab armies. What is holding them back? The answer is simple. Palestinians are the only population in the world not eligible for services by the UN Refugee Agency. Instead, these descendants are governed by UNRWA, which holds generation after generation trapped in refugee camps, denied integration in the Arab countries they were born in, and denied resettlement elsewhere. Some of UNRWA's donors are waking up to the problem. As Swiss Foreign Minister has recently put it, by supporting UNRWA, we are only keeping the conflict alive. I thank you, Mr. President.
So the thing is that they haven't just been killing Jews. There's a lot of killing of Christians that goes on. There's a lot of killing of the Druzim, or the Druze people, that goes on. There's even killing among Shia and Sunni, in different tribal situations in Afghanistan. All the different areas of the Middle East, a lot of times there's conflict that are Muslim on Muslim, and there's a lot of violence that goes on and oppression that goes on. So let's not beat around the bush here and pretend that Israel is this bloodthirsty nation that is out here trying to just kill everybody, because that's not the truth. And let's also be clear that Muslims, by and large, are not bloodthirsty and violent people. I've known some Muslims that are amazing people, super sweet-hearted people, very generous, very kind, very loving and warming and welcoming. So don't get it twisted, and don't take it the wrong way that Muslims are, as a whole, some sort of violent, wicked people. There are select cult and people who abuse religion throughout every group, including the Jews. And I've made videos on that which have been taken down by YouTube. And I'm in the process of regathering up all that content and reposting it up on Rumble. So I will make sure to let you guys see all that. But every religious group has its wackos, has its crazy people who've done stupid things. And we have to be honest about that. We can't just, whitewash the history. And that's what a lot of people want to do here. So the fact is that they are killing a lot of Christians. If you look at, and Christians don't talk about this, which is very odd, because a lot of them don't speak out about what's going on against their people, which I think is very important too. If you look at Bethlehem and Nazareth, those used to be 80% Christian. Now it's like 80 to 90% Muslim, because of all the Christians who have been slaughtered and driven out by the Muslims who were treating them so harshly. And the 2 million Christians fled Iraq. Thousands of Christians were slaughtered in Nigeria. The list goes on and on. Syrian Christians had it very rough here recently. And so the other part of that is that there's this rewriting of the history, like I said, this claiming that this land has always been Palestine, and this has always been the Palestinian kingdom, and that these Jews are, are making up their own history, and they're making up their own, artifacts. Look for yourself. The thing about that is that there is absolutely no history of the Palestinian people. There's no history of a Palestinian nation or anything like that. There's been no dynasties or anything like that coming from Palestine. There are thousands of books in Europe documenting the land of Judea, documenting the Jews being scattered throughout the lands, especially after the Roman Empire, especially after Titus came and uprooted their temple, even took with him Josephus, who became his translator and wrote the histories for the Romans on their conquering of Judea. And one of the works is called The War of the Jews and Antiquities. This person is named Josephus. You can look this up for yourself. There is a long history of the Jews being in the land. Now, even the Christians have a history of the Jews being in the land. Jesus was a Jew. He went to the temple. Their temple was standing there, Solomon's temple. And this is all supposed to be taking place in the 1st century. Islam doesn't even show up until the 7th century. Okay? So the idea that Jerusalem wasn't linked to the Jews at all and there's no history of that is simply preposterous. And the name Palestine literally comes because 60 years later, after the Romans had conquered Jerusalem, the Jews are still fighting against the Romans. And you have the Bar Kokhba revolt, and you have these different revolts. And the Romans renamed the land Philistia as an insult to the Jews. They named it after the Philistines, which had been wiped out in order to distance the Jews from their land and to insult them. And so the whole idea of the land being called Palestine or Philistia was simply meant as a way of apartheid against the Jews. And there's so much history there.
Palestine, which is depicted in green, had territory in 1917. And as we move through history, that green becomes smaller and smaller.
This diagram is completely bogus. I'll bring you up to speed. Make sure to follow me here for more. Let's go back to 110 AD. Hadrian's Roman Empire took control of Israel. The Jews living in Jerusalem revolted against the Romans. This caused the Romans to burn the city and expel the Jews from their homeland. Afterwards, Hadrian renamed the land Syria Palestina after the Jews' sworn enemies, the Assyrians and the extinct Philistines, who came from Greece and were not Arab. Skip ahead. Throughout the years, many other empires would conquer this land, many of them being Arab. Naturally, Arab people moved in, not only from those empires, but from Arab empires that preceded them. In the late 1800s, Jewish Zionists decided to start moving back to their ancestral homeland. From 1300 to 1923, the Ottoman Empire had control of this region, but it was a non-defined region with no self-governance or borders subject to the laws and rules of the larger empire that controlled it. There was no national identity because there was never a Palestinian state. It was just the Ottoman Empire collapsed after World War I, leaving control over the region in the hands of the British. This started the British Mandate of Palestine. Again, it had that name because of the Romans. Lots of infighting started happening. Zionists proclaimed they'd be happy if they had 1 square foot to call Israel, and the British wanted hands off. After the Holocaust, Jewish refugees fled to Israel. In 1947, the UN partitioned the land, a state for the Arabs and a state for the Jews. The Arab state for Palestine would have the West Bank, Jerusalem, Gaza, Hebron, and several other cities, while the Jews would have Tel Aviv and the land to the south of the West Bank, which was mostly desert, as well as small portions to the north. The Jews were given more land despite having less people, but the Arabs would get the majority of the cities on the land and Jerusalem, which was the holiest site in all of Judaism and the 3rd holiest site in Islam. After the partition, Israel declared independence and the Arabs declared war. The Transjordanian Arab Legion assisted, slaughtering Jews in the old Jewish quarter of Jerusalem and leveling the oldest synagogue in the city. The result of this war? These borders. Except the portions they would have you believe are Palestine aren't. Egypt took control of Gaza, and Jordan annexed the West Bank, no Palestine. In 1967, another war ensued. Israel fought a 3-front war against Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, defeating all of them in only 6 days. Israel made massive land claims. These were the new borders. They took the Golan Heights, Sinai, the West Bank, and Gaza. Eventually, most of the Golan Heights and Sinai were given back to Egypt and Syria, respectively. But no Palestinian state was to be seen. In 1988, Hamas was founded, their covenant openly calling for the extermination of all Jews, claiming it as essential to Islam. Islam. Fighting continued in Gaza. In 2005, Israel unilaterally withdrew their forces but maintained ownership. The people living in Gaza democratically elected Hamas as their sole governing authority in 2006, causing Israel to put a blockade in place. This brings us to the modern conflict. Follow me to be kept up to date with what's
Dead Sea Scrolls. And even the New Testament has a lost gospel called Thomas, which was found in Nag Hammadi, right, which is considered part of the Dead Sea Scrolls collection. And so there's so much history tying the Jews to this land that it's undeniable. Coins, the ritual baths, the list goes on and on and on. Here, look at...
How do you explain that there's archaeological proof that the Jews were here for over 3,000 years?
كيف بتفسر وجود آثار يهودية بتبين إنه كان في يهود قبل 3000 سنة؟
3000 سنة؟
آثار يهودية عمرها 3000 سنة، كيف بتفسر هذا الموضوع؟
ما أتوقعش إن في آثار.
I don't expect that there are Jewish archaeological finds.
There's a lot, actually.
هو عم بحكي إنه في كتير آثار يهودية عمرها 3000 سنة.
ما عنديش علم، ما بتوقعش إنه يكون موجود.
I don't know about this and I don't
ممكن
expect
إنها
it to exist. نعم.
آثار دينية يهودية.
Perhaps they are religious Jewish
Religious, yes.
ruins or findings on archaeology.
No, there's coins of Jewish kingdoms here.
He's saying that they are religious Jews.
No, but
They're
there was kingdoms.
مش شيء ديني ولكن بحكي إنه في كان ممالك يهودية.
No.
No?
No,
Okay.
I don't think so. There isn't any.
Okay. So there's a lot of archaeological finds of Jewish things from the Jews.
تعالوا ماما عندي
Does she know about the archaeological finds of Jewish
في
things?
كثير آثار أو في كثير آثار عم بيلاقوها بتكون أصلها يهودي. هل سمعتي عن الآثار اليهودية؟
فيش آثار في بلادنا أصلها يهودي.
We have no archaeology and no ruins that are Jewish.
None?
In our country.
No. هذا البلد فلسطيني كنعاني.
This country is Palestinian, Canaanite.
أصوله بتحكي إنه هو بلد عربي.
The origins and the ruins and the archaeology say that they are Arab, and before they were Arab, they were Canaanite.
Okay. But there are lots of things that show Jewish.
بس في آثار بتفرجي إنها كانت يهودية.
لا كله عماله بتزور. إسرائيل يعني معروف إن هي بتحارب التاريخ.
And it's known that Israel is fighting with history.
ثانيا اليهود هم يعني هم مش أصل كانوا ساكنين هم عبارة عن قبائل.
Were not originally from here. They were tribes.
يعني هدول كانوا يتنقلوا بين
and they used to move around.
عدة دول.
Between many
يعني
countries.
إذا ممكن الآثار اللي كانت لهم هون آثار عابرة مش أصليين.
They might have ruins that were passing by that show that they were passing by, but they are not natives of this area.
Do you recognize that there was Jewish sovereignty here a long time
sovereignty.
ago? Yeah.
ولكن هل تعترف أو هل تعترف إنه كان في سيادة يهودية من زمان؟
لا هو السيادة اليهودية ما كانت موجودة ولكن هجدت بالتدريج.
So it wasn't here, but so Jewish sovereignty didn't exist, but it came gradually.
Okay, but in like 2,000 years ago, there's more? Sorry, go ahead.
هي اجت بالتدريج كيف انه كانوا هم اول شيء جماعات قليله وبعدها صاروا يجوا سواح وكانوا يستقروا في البلد ومن ثم صاروا جماعة أكبر ومن ثم صار لهم سيادة أكبر.
So they first came in small groups as tourists and then they came more and more and then they started settling here.
No, I'm talking about biblical times.
إحنا عم نحكي عن الزمان يعني أوقات
2,500 years ago, prophets' times, yes.
أوقات الأنبياء خلينا نحكي قبل 2500 سنة أكثر.
There are coins that are Jewish coins.
لقوا مثلا عملات عليها عبري.
لا هسه لحظة هي ديانة كديانة كانت موجودة وهذا ما في حدا بيقدر ينكرها. ولكن كإسرائيل اللي هي بالمصطلح الحالي ما كان موجود.
So as a religion, yes, it has existed. But as a political entity, as Israel, it's new.
Here, it's all made up. Check out this pamphlet by the Palestinian authorities themselves. And so you have to look at the facts. The Jews pray towards the Temple Mount. They pray towards there, while the Muslims there will actually turn their backs to Al-Aqsa Mosque and pray towards Mecca, because the fact of the matter is that the Temple Mount is the Jews' most holiest place. It is the most holiest place that they had. And forever, the Jews have had to pay a tax in order just to pray at the Western Wall, which was as close as they were allowed to get to the Temple Mount. And they've had to pay this tax and go through all of these strenuous, agreements with the Muslims in order to just maintain being allowed to pray. Jews have always moved to the land. And in the 1850s, there were actually more Jews in Jerusalem than there were Arabs. And the first convention talking about reestablishing the land and creating a government there, because there really was no government, was in 97. And delegates were sent out to the Arabs, but all the different groups of Arabs that lived in the land, which were not calling themselves Palestinians, they were not united in any front. They didn't even come together in order to send a delegation, because they couldn't agree to each other on religious grounds or on tribal grounds or on, territorial grounds that they were dealing with. From things that someone from your village stole something from me, and so this, that, and the other, and they had these beefs that went with each other, that they couldn't even bring delegates forward. And this is actually painted against the Jews as, well, the Jews had delegates were at the hearings with the British for like the Balfour Declaration and stuff, but the Muslims didn't. And the fact is because the Muslims couldn't come together to send delegates. That's the truth that no one wants to mention. I recommend a book called Israel by Daniel Gordonis. A great history of the land, pretty well balanced, and see for yourself. Look at all the facts and see if you can't decipher something else out of it.
One of those facts you should consider is that a people from a nation should be able to name big historical characters from their nation, or historical events, leaders, dynasties, things of that nature. But with the Palestinians, they really can't, except for Yasser Arafat.
This stela is what the Egyptians would have called a triumph stela, a victory stela, commemorating victory over foreign peoples.
Most of the hieroglyphic inscription celebrates Merneptah's triumph over Libya, his enemy to the west. But almost as an afterthought, he mentions his conquest of people to the east in just 2 lines.
The text reads, Ashkelon has been brought captive. Gezer has been taken captive. Yanoam in the North Jordan Valley has been seized. Israel.
Name an important Palestinian in history.
سمي لنا شخص مهم من التاريخ الفلسطيني. شخصية مهمة من التاريخ الفلسطيني.
يعني ياسر عرفات.
غيره.
يعني رمزنا وراح يضل رمزنا.
غير ياسر عرفات.
غير ياسر عرفات.
Other than ياسر عرفات.
يعني مليانة شخصيات بس مش جميعها متذكر.
There's a lot of important people, but I can't remember everybody.
خلينا على ياسر عرفات.
Let's stick to ياسر.
Anyone in ancient history before 1900?
هل في أي شخصية مهمة؟
A famous Palestinian.
قبل 1900. هل في شخصية مهمة فلسطينية قبل 1900؟
1900 لا صراحة ما بعرف. 1900 لا يعني القدامى موجود هو بس يعني.
I'm sure there is, of course there is, but I can't remember.
Name someone important in Palestinian history.
ممكن تسمي لي شخصية مهمة من التاريخ الفلسطيني؟
أبو عمار.
في حدا ثاني؟ أبو عمار.
Okay. From ancient history?
في أي حدا قبل أبو عمار؟
كان؟ لا قبل أبو عمار ما بنعرف حدا.
We don't know anybody before أبو عمار.
Okay.
ليلى غنام، دكتورة ليلى غنام.
ليلى غنام.
دكتورة ليلى غنام.
The governorate of Ramadan Bureau.
Okay. Ancient history.
هل في حدا من التاريخ الفلسطيني مثلا قبل 1900؟ قبل العام 1900 ممكن تجاوب حتى لو مش على الكاميرا. تعرفش؟ No, we don't know.
No. Okay. Name a famous Palestinian.
في فلسطيني مشهور، هل تعرفوا حدا فلسطيني مشهور؟
محمود درويش.
محمود درويش.
حسن كنفاني.
حسن كنفاني.
Okay.
هل في فلسطيني مشهور من قبل 200 سنة أو؟
مش متذكرة حاليا يعني.
I can't remember right now.
I don't know.
Name an important Palestinian in history.
سمي لنا شخصية فلسطينية مهمة في التاريخ.
في التاريخ العمار.
Besides, other than
كمان.
Arafat.
أحمد ياسين.
أحمد ياسين.
نعم.
Okay.
أحمد ياسين رنتيسي.
Rentisi? Who's Rentisi?
You don't know? You say learn your history?
Yeah, I know. Well, it's not your history, not mine.
No, it's our history.
Okay, I'll look him up.
صراحة كثير أسماء بموقع فلسطين، كثير قادة بموقع فلسطين، بس دائما نعرف شغلة كويس.
There are many Palestinian
اللي
leaders,
استشهد.
but know this: the good ones die or are killed or become martyrs.
No, but this is before Zionism. I'm talking about before 1900.
قبل الصهيونية، قبل 1900. I don't know.
Anybody? So like,
You just said I don't know.
I'll give
Do you
him
want me to
one.
hit you?
I give him one.
Give him.
يمكن أنا بعرف بس نسيت.
I'm sure I know, but I forgot.
ياسر عرفات.
No, 200 years ago, 300 years ago, 1,000 years ago,
لا ما نعرف.
You don't know anybody from 200 years ago?
1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago.
تحكي على الكنعانيين وزمان.
Yeah. So even the Canaanites.
كثير زمان.
Who's an important Canaanite, Palestinian? Who? You don't learn that?
لا تعلمنا أكيد
You
تعلمنا.
learned it.
إحنا تعلمنا بس.
طب أنت احكي لنا. You tell us. Corey, you tell us.
Name an important Palestinian in history. For you, someone who's important for you.
Like in which way?
Anyway, doesn't matter.
Everybody is important for me. All Palestinian people is very important for me.
Okay. Name a Palestinian who was important to everybody in history.
In history, you know, in Palestinian history,
yeah.
Basically, you know, everybody complete each other. You know, Abdul Qadir Husseini, he was good. Azadin Qassam was good. Abu Jihad was good.
Who's Abu Jihad?
Abu Jihad, you know, Palestinian leader in PLO.
Okay.
He was good, you know.
Okay.
Yasser Arafat, he was good. Like I told you, everybody, each generation complete each other.
What about in ancient history, before, more than 100 years ago, before the Jews came? Who is somebody famous in Palestinian history?
Somebody famous in Palestinian history?
Yeah.
In my age, that's all I remember.
No, but did you learn in school about Palestinians from 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago?
They don't teach us that much.
Okay.
I'm sorry, they don't teach us that much.
Okay. Name an important Palestinian.
بعرفش السؤال مظبوط.
مش مشكلة. بدنا اسم فلسطيني مشهور أو اسم حدا فلسطيني مشهور.
شخصية فلسطينية مشهورة.
شخصية فلسطينية مشهورة.
عايشة ولا ميتة؟ هون في أموات في أموات له شخصية.
Either. Tell me someone.
ها؟
It doesn't matter.
أو متوفي.
أبو عمار.
Okay. Someone older. Someone from 100 years ago, 200 years ago.
قبل 100 سنة أو 200 سنة.
هذا من قبل 200 سنة. هذا من قبل 200 سنة. 200 سنة. مين يعني بدك
Or ancient.
I don't know exactly يعني.
What about Jesus?
Jesus?
Yeah.
Jesus, very nice Jesus. Every time Jesus.
Was he Palestinian?
It's Palestinian, yes. It's 2,000 years ago.
An important Palestinian in history. Name an important Palestinian in history.
شخصية فلسطينية.
During the last year, maybe Yasser Arafat.
What about in ancient times? A long time ago.
Husseini.
Which Husseini?
Husseini. I forget the first name. Husseini. He's
الحاج أمين الحسيني.
Amin Husseini.
Okay.
Yes.
So that was in 1930s?
Yes, I think so.
Okay. What about before that? Like 200 years ago, 300 years ago?
Oh my God. Really, I don't. It's not in my mind right now. But I think all the history in Palestine, we have many leaders for the Palestinian people. But
Not just a leader, anybody important. From a long time ago. Anyone?
السؤال بسرعة بتيجي مرة واحدة.
Let's ask another question.
19th century and Zionism, Jews have always migrated, or as we say in Hebrew, gone up to the land of Israel. In the 17th and 18th centuries, Jews came from all over the Jewish world, from Europe, from North Africa, from Yemen, in small numbers due to the harsh conditions, but there was always a steady movement of Jews coming to Israel. The first Zionist Congress was held in 1897, but 50 years beforehand, in the 1850s, there were more Jews than Muslims in Jerusalem. In the rest of the land, yes, there were more Muslims, but it is important to know that even before the start of the Zionist movement, there were dozens of Jewish settlements in the land of Israel. In the last decades of the Ottoman Empire, as in all empires, there were lots of different groups. Some groups got bigger with time, some smaller, some bought land, some sold land. Many European powers bought land for institutions, and some groups, mostly Germans and Americans, settled in the land of Israel to speed up the second coming of Jesus. Many different groups. None of the groups use the word Palestinian to describe themselves. The first Zionist Congress took place in 1897. The Zionist movement was a national movement, not a colonialist or an imperialist movement, but a national one of many. This was the age of the fall of empires, the German Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and the Ottoman Empire, and of the rise of national movements. And the Zionist movement was the national movement of the Jews. It is as simple as that. In the first half of the 20th century, millions of people moved from one place to another to create nation states. What's special about the Jews is that they never stole or used violence to take any land in the land of Israel. I'm always getting comments from Muslims and pro-Palestinians about Jews stealing the land from the local Arabs. Here is a challenge for you. Give me the name of one village that the Jews stole from the Arabs from the 7th century, when the Arab Caliphate colonized the land of Israel, until 1947, when the Arabs started a war to wipe out the Jews. From the year 636 till 1947, not a single square foot was stolen by the Jews. Again, if you don't like what I'm saying, then prove me wrong. Give me the names of villages that Jews stole prior to the War of Independence. On the other hand, I can give you lots of names of Jewish villages that Arabs, or Palestinians if you will, destroyed before 1948. Take Hebron, for example. Jews lived in Hebron for hundreds of years. In 1929, the Arabs, not 1 or 10, but whole gangs of Arabs, murdered 70 Jews, and the ancient Jewish settlement had to be abandoned until it was brought back into Jewish hands in 1967. You want more names of Jewish villages that were abandoned because of Arab violence? Here are some more. Many were rebuilt after a few years. The Arabs used violence against Jewish civilians in the land of Israel many years before the occupation and many years before the land of Israel was established. And by the way, they didn't only use violence against the Jews. Christians suffered as well. Remember the German and American settlements I told you about? They suffered as well. The family of John Steinbeck, the American novelist, had a farm outside Jaffa, or at least they had it until Arabs broke in and murdered Steinbeck's great uncle and sexually assaulted his wife and his daughter. Here is an interesting anecdote. Two other great American novelists, Mark Twain and Herman Melville, visited the land of Israel, and like hundreds of other pilgrims, they wrote about how neglected the land was, and many wrote about how violent the local Arabs were. From 1917 till 1948, the British and the French were in control of the Middle East. The Jews blamed the British for being pro-Arab, and the Arabs blamed the British for being pro-Jewish. I will tell it as it was. The British were pro-British. They had two main interests in the region: to have oil flowing from Iraq to the port of Haifa, and to ensure the Suez Canal remained open. And because both of these interests lay in the hands of the Arabs, they were pro-Arab. Today it is very fashionable to be against colonial powers, and of course they did do a lot of damage. But I find it absurd that pro-Palestinians are anti-colonial
as it was the Roman Empire that gave the name Palestine to the area, and the British Empire that gave it its borders. When the British and the French drew lines on maps, they invented two nations that never existed before, the Palestinians and the Jordanians. Another fact that is often overlooked is that pro-Palestinians are always talking about Jewish immigrants coming from Europe. No one talks about the Arabs who came to the land of Israel. Hundreds of thousands of Arabs from Egypt, Syria, and other places entered the land of Israel in the 1930s and 40s to work for the British and are now seen as native Palestinians. It is hard to estimate the number of Arabs who entered the land of Israel between 1917 to 1947 to work for the British, as the borders were open, but the number is in the hundreds of thousands. Probably about half of the population of Gaza came to the land of Israel during the British Mandate time. Their last names usually hint towards the actual origin of the family. I find it absurd that people like my great-grandmother, who came to Israel from Eastern Europe in the 1920s, homeland for generations, are seen as white colonialists, while Egyptians who came to work for the British in 1945 are seen as native Palestinians. Now you might be saying, who cares where they came from and if they have been here for generations? They have the right to self-determination. And again, I agree. In 1947, the UN proposed the division of the land into a Jewish state and an Arab state. The Jews said yes, and the Arabs said no, and then started a war in a bid to eliminate the Jews. The morning after the partition plan, Palestinians attacked a bus and murdered 5 Jews. This is how the war was started. They were offered a state, they said no, and start murdering Jewish civilians. Not a single Jew was spared in all of the places that fell into local Palestinian hands. Luckily for us, after 15 months of fighting the local Arabs and the 5 Arab armies that invaded Israel, we won. And yes, during the War of Independence, many Arab villages were destroyed and about 700,000 people were displaced. That's what happens when you try to wipe out your neighbors. You might well lose and have to pay the price. At the same time, 800,000 Jews were brutally expelled from Muslim countries. For some reason, no one cares about them or want to tell their story. Millions of articles and papers have been written about the Palestinians who had to evacuate their homes because of a war they started, yet very little has been written about the Jews living in Muslim countries who were subjected to pogroms and had to flee, even though they were innocent. Please tell me why you care so deeply about the Palestinian refugees, and yet you couldn't care less about all the millions of other refugees who had to flee at the same time. 14 million Germans, about the same number of Hindus and Muslims, Ukrainians, Armenians, Poles, people from the Balkans, and I could go on and on. The Palestinian refugees are the most privileged refugees in the world. Some say that the partition plan wasn't fair as the Jews made up 1/3 of the population but got 2/3 of the land. To that I will say this, the Arabs actually also got what is now known as Jordan, so in fact the Jews got a much smaller part. And I should also add that the Arabs got all the good land and the Jews got the swampland and the desert land. And now I'm going to state a fact that is definitely going to annoy all the haters of Israel. The Jews took the swampland and the desert land and made the impossible possible. We turned the land into gold. Israel is pioneer in irrigation systems and desalination system. Israel invented vegetables and fruits that can grow in salt water and yet taste sweet. As for the Arabs, the large part of their land is now polluted and contaminated. After 1948, the Palestinians had years to establish a free Palestinian state, as they were under Egyptian and Jordanian rule. Yet they didn't do that. In 1964, the Palestinians established the PLO, or the Palestinian Liberation Organization. Now this is interesting. 1964 is 3 years before the Six-Day War. So before Israel occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, and before a single settlement was built, they were already calling for the destruction of Israel. When the Arabs say free Palestine, they don't mean we want an independent Palestinian state next to Israel. What they want is a Palestinian state that replaces Israel. The Palestinians kept rejecting all offers made to them from 1947 till 2008, when Ehud Olmert, the Israeli Prime Minister, offered the Palestinians all the West Bank and East Jerusalem as their capital. They said no to every offer that was made to them, invested all the money they received from the world in terror, and then cried that they were their victims. The Palestinians do have a harder life than we Israelis, but they only have themselves to blame. So what is the solution? When will there be peace? Not in the near future, because this conflict is not about the land. I've already told you that even before the Six-Day War and even before 1948, the Palestinians were trying to wipe out the Jews. Here is another example. Take Gaza. In 2005, Israel withdrew from the Gaza Strip. Gaza is an Israeli and Jew-free area. The Palestinians get more money than any other group on the planet, from the US, from the European Union, from Arab countries, from the UN. And what do they do with this money? Infrastructure, education? No. They build tunnels and buy weapons to kill Jews. Why do they do that? The Hamas constitution makes it very clear. The first sentence is, Israel will exist until Islam wipes it out. It doesn't say we want peace. It doesn't say we want a Palestinian state. It clearly says until Islam wipes it out. They want a Muslim caliphate. I respect Hamas for one thing only, for actually expressing and being clear about what they want, which is to eliminate Israel. Personally, I want the Palestinians to have a democratic state with human rights and freedoms, and I wish for all Arabs and Muslims to have the same. But what I want is not necessarily what they want. To solve the problem, you need to understand the problem. And the problem is made up of two things. One which Westerners don't understand anymore, religion, and one which Westerners don't want to talk about, values. Religion plays no role at all in European politics. In the US, politicians do say, God bless America, and the debate surrounding abortion is partly religious. But when it comes to foreign policies, you don't hear American generals talk about spreading the word of Jesus. In the Muslim world, it is very different. When Arabs kill Jews at a music festival, or Christians in a school in Nigeria, or one another in Syria, Yemen, Libya, what is it they shout? Allahu Akbar, God is great. Jihad is a religious war against the infidels. To many Europeans, the words infidels and heresy probably remind them of dark days that played out hundreds of years ago, when Catholics and Protestants were killing each other. Sadly, this is still the situation in some parts of the Muslim world. Just think about the organizations you hear about in the Muslim world: Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamic Jihad, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Boko Haram, the Taliban. These aren't national organizations. They are all religious organizations. Now let's talk about the bigger issue, values. Lots of people run from this as if they were running from fire, because the biggest concern is potentially being called a racist. I criticize all groups: Americans, Germans, Britney Spears fans, ultra-Orthodox Jews, women, Gen Z, and Muslims. There were peace in all of the Middle East and only the Arab Muslim Palestinians were resorting to violence. I would say, okay, maybe we are in the wrong. But if the Palestinians were using violence before 1967 and before 1948, and almost all of the Arab Muslim countries are dictatorships with high levels of violence and low levels of human rights, then maybe there's really a problem here. I'm also getting comments from Muslims blaming colonialism and the Americans for all the problems in the Muslim world. And it is true that the creation of many countries and borders in Africa and Asia were determined by the interest of the European empires, and that the US think primarily about its own interests. But I'm always shocked to find that Muslims take no responsibility for their wrongdoing. The fact that most of the Muslim countries aren't democratic has nothing to do with the US. The fact that 17 of the 20 most dangerous countries for the LGBTQ community are Muslims has nothing to do with colonialism. The fact that almost all of the most dangerous places in the world to be Christians are Muslim has nothing to do with imperialism. The Muslim world is huge. It has a lot of oil, and its failure has very little to do with colonialism. Look at the Jews. 1/3 of them were murdered by the Nazis. Israel has no oil and it is surrounded by enemies, and yet we are successful. And it's not because of American money. Most of that money has to be used to buy military equipment from American companies. And beside, the Palestinians get way more money. We are successful because we are open-minded, think outside the box, invest in education, and are not violent. This is true outside the Middle East too. Look at Arab Muslim communities in Europe. If there were violent riots in Paris or Sweden, Rotterdam or London, would it be in the Jewish neighborhoods or the Arab neighborhoods? Peace will only come when the Arabs change their values, when Muslim countries become democratic, when all of the different groups in Syria stop killing one another, when Iranian women are free to cover or not cover their hair, when the Christian population stops shrinking in the Middle East, and when the Israeli Arabs stop killing one another.
War. This week, a pogrom was carried out on the citizens of the State of Israel in unprecedented proportions. Hundreds of Jews were slaughtered, men, women, and children, and even babies were taken hostage by Hamas. When the State of Israel was founded after the Holocaust, we swore that these sites would never return. Anyone who ever had a doubt as to who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in this story, the time has come to wake up. Reality is blowing up in our faces, and facing pure evil, the good and just are even clearer. Israel now has to react in incredible power that has not yet been witnessed. It's important to clarify, we are a Western, democratic, strong country that is fighting for its life against an extreme terrorist entity that is no less cruel and barbaric than ISIS. The rules of the game have changed. Even though Israel, as usual, will try not to hurt innocent bystanders, let's be clear, in a society that overwhelmingly glorifies murder and sacrifices death, innocent civilians are getting harder to come by. A street that spits on a girl's naked corpse, a person who laughs as his children hit and make fun of a captured Israeli child calling for his mother, all these sentence themselves to death. This is the time to support Israel with all your strength on social media and all the means at your disposal. We are on the front of the free world against the horrors that some of you choose to close their eyes against. To those who are about to criticize and lecture us in the news studios and on social media, I say, we don't care about your biased media, we don't care about your eye-rolling, we don't care about your holier-than-thou attitude, we don't care about your deceitful posts. The gates of hell are about to be opened on Gaza, and when harsh images will come out of there, and there will be harsh images, remember who are the bloodthirsty monsters in this story and who is on the side of protecting life. Read my lips. Am Yisrael Chai, the nation of Israel is alive.
Adonai echad, Elohim.